Imagine standing in your own driveway at 6 in the morning, the Arizona desert air still biting with that sharp, pre-dawn chill, while two patrol cars block your exit and your neighbors peek through their blinds like they're watching a premiere at Sundance. My wife, Sarah, was standing there in handcuffs, the cold steel clicking against her wrist with a sound that felt like a punch to my gut, while Mrs. Gable, our HOA president, stood on her porch across the street, clutching a mug of tea and wearing a grin so smug you could have seen it from orbit. She'd actually called the local news, convinced she was the hero of a high-stakes sting operation. But what she didn't realize was that the badge Sarah was about to pull out of her pocket wasn't and Oppos. Tea just a prop for a costume party, and the next 10 minutes we're going to turn Gable's carefully constructed suburban empire into a pile of ash. You see, my name is Jack, and I'm a guy who just wanted a quiet life after 12 years in the Navy. So we moved into Silver Creek Estates, thinking we'd found paradise. But we quickly realized that in some neighborhoods, peace is just a thin veil for a very specific kind of tyranny. Sarah is the kind of woman who makes people sit up straighter just by walking into a room. She spent 15 years as a senior special agent with the Department of Justice, specifically in the Financial Crimes Division, taking down people who think they're smarter than the tax code. But to the bored, power-hungry elite of Silver Creek, she was just the, in quote, mysterious woman, in quote, who didn't in Oppos. Tea fit the mold. This whole nightmare started about 18 months ago. And honestly, looking back, I should have seen it coming because Mrs. Gable, a woman who treated the HOA bylaws like they were the Ten Commandments, had decided from day one that Sarah was, in quote, suspicious, in quote. The problem with being an undercover financial investigator is that your life doesn't look like a 9 to 5. So Sarah would leave at 2 a.m. for surveillance, sleep until noon, and drive a rotation of nondescript government vehicles that changed every week, which in Mrs. Gable's narrow, beige-colored world could only mean one thing. I'd see Gable out there every morning at exactly 7 a.m. in her neon tracksuits, clipboard in hand, prowling the sidewalks for a blade of grass that was a fraction of an inch too long or a trash can left out 10 minutes past the deadline. But her real hobby was watching our house. She'd stage whisper to the neighbors about, in quote, shady dealings, in quote, and in quote, women with no visible means of support, in quote, letting the implication of something illicit hang in the air like the scent of creosote before a storm. And the more Sarah ignored her, the more Gable's obsession curdled into something truly dangerous. The breaking point happened on a Tuesday, when Sarah was actually working a massive case involving offshore money laundering, and she was sitting in our driveway in an unmarked SUV, wearing her tactical vest under a light jacket and speaking into an earpiece, doing the kind of high-stakes work that keeps the economy from collapsing. Gable must have thought she finally had the, in quote, smoking gun, in quote, because she came storming over, pounding on the window and screaming about, in quote, police impersonation, in quote, and in quote, destroying property values, in quote. And when Sarah just calmly rolled up the window and continued her call, Gable went nuclear. She issued a formal HOA violation for, in quote, engaging in law enforcement role play, in quote, slapping us with a $500 a day fine. And then she did something truly stupid. She hired a high-priced attorney using community funds to start lien proceedings against our house, claiming we were a, in quote, security threat, in quote, to the neighborhood. I remember sitting at the kitchen table that night, looking at the legal paperwork and feeling that old military, in quote, rules of engagement, in quote, instinct kick in because Gable had made a fatal mistake. She assumed we were just easy targets who didn't know how to read the fine print. I spent the next 3 days buried in the HOA's master declaration, and I found, in quote, jackpot, in quote, on page 64, which stated that any legal expenditure over $300 required a full board vote and a signed resolution, something Gable had completely bypassed in her rush to crucify us. But the deeper I dug into the association's annual reports to find where she was getting the money for this vendetta, the more the numbers started to look, in quote, fuzzy, in quote, like a photograph taken through a dirty lens, and I realized that Sarah was and Oppos, the only one in the neighborhood with a secret. While Gable was busy posting, in quote, community safety alerts, in quote, on the neighborhood Facebook group, painting my wife as some kind of unhinged vigilante, I was realizing that our HOA's, in quote, beautification fund, in quote, was bleeding dry, yet the community pool was turning a sickly shade of lime green and the perimeter fence was rotting off its posts. I reached out to a few guys I knew, old friends from the service and a retired forensic accountant who lived 3 blocks down named Miller, and we started hobby project that involved a lot of late nights and a lot of very boring spreadsheets. We discovered that Gable had authorized dozens of payments to a company called, Lawn and Amp, Order Maintenance, which sounded professional enough, except that the business address was a P.O. box registered to her own nephew in the next county over, and they hadn't an oppos. T-mowed a single lawn in Silver Creek in over 2 years. The irony was so thick you could have choked on it. Here was this woman screaming about law and order and reporting my wife to the FBI for, impersonating an officer, while she was running a textbook embezzlement scheme right under our noses, stealing nearly $60,000 from her own neighbors to fund what I later found out was a very expensive gambling habit in Vegas. She had become so emboldened by her own perceived power that she thought she was untouchable. But she didn't realize that she'd picked a fight with the one woman in the state whose entire job was to dismantle people exactly like her. The morning of the arrest, was supposed to be Gable and Oppo's grand finale, her gotcha, moment where she'd prove to the world that she was the protector of Silver Creek. And when the 2 officers, young guys who looked like they'd rather be anywhere else, arrived at her beckoning, she was practically vibrating with glee. They did their job. They followed the report of a, suspicious person in tactical gear, and they put Sarah in cuffs because, on paper, Gable's report looked legitimate, but then the air in the neighborhood just shifted. Sarah looked the lead officer dead in the eye, told him exactly where her credentials were, and when he opened that leather badge wallet and saw the gold DOJ shield and the, senior special agent, ID, his face went from, stern professional, to, I made a massive mistake, in about 3 seconds. He didn't oppose. He just take the cuffs off. He apologized so profusely I thought he might offer to wash her car, but the best part was watching Mrs. Gable. She started shrieking from her porch that the ID was a fake, that we were part of a deep state conspiracy, and that the news cameras, which were now rolling, needed to see the, truth, But the reporter for Channel 12 was already smelling a much bigger story, and it wasn't an oppos. The one Gable had sold him. Sarah just walked over to the edge of Gable's property, stood there with the kind of terrifyingly calm professional coldness she usually reserves for cartel lawyers, and said, Mrs. Gable, filing a false police report is a state crime, but lying to a federal agent during an active investigation? That's Title 18, Section 1001, and you've been doing it for 18 months, The next hour was a blur of Gable trying to retreat in her house while Miller and I walked out into the street with a stack of financial records that we handed directly to the news crew and the police, explaining exactly where the, beautification fund, had actually gone. The look on Gable's face when she realized her, nephew's, business was being outed on the new news was a mixture of pure terror and a crumbling ego, and by the time the sun was high in the sky, the police wearing and oppos, leaving. They were calling for a supervisor to handle the new, allegations of felony embezzlement, In the weeks that followed, the HOA board was dissolved. Gable was indicted on 3 counts of felony theft and 1 count of filing a false report. And the neighborhood finally felt like it could breathe again, but the damage she did to the, trust, of the community is something that's going to take years to fix. We ended up staying, mostly because the new board asked Sarah to help oversee a proper audit, which she did pro bono, just to make sure every cent was accounted for. But I still think about that morning, about the sheer audacity of a person who thinks a title and a clipboard makes them God. It makes you wonder, though, how many other, Mrs. Gables, are out there right now, using their tiny slice of power to hide their own, shady dealings, while they point the finger at everyone else. Was she just Karen, who got carried away, or was the harassment of my wife a calculated move to distract the neighborhood from the money she was stealing, hoping that if she made enough noise, nobody would look at the books? I've heard people say that HOAs are a necessary evil to keep property values up, but after seeing a federal agent cuffed in her own driveway, I'm starting to think the values we're protecting aren't and oppos. Worth the price of our freedom. What do you think? Is the HOA system fundamentally broken, or did we just run into the one-in-a-million monster who took it too far? Drop a comment and let me know if you've ever had a neighbor try to police you while they were breaking the law themselves, because I have a feeling this story ISN and oppos. As rare as we'd like to believe.